Most women would have smiled politely and stepped aside. Most women would have swallowed the sting, laughed it off, pretended the ache didn't exist, but not her, not this time. It started with a photo, a family photo, the kind that was supposed to freeze a perfect moment in time, the glow of togetherness, the unity of blood. But behind every frame there are shadows no lens can capture, and in this photo her shadow was deliberately cropped out. Margaret stood by the sliding glass door of her daughter's house, hands lightly trembling on the edge of the curtain. She watched them laughing, her daughters, their husbands, her grandchildren, all dressed in coordinated earth tones, posing under the golden hour sun in the backyard. A photographer with a Canon and 2 white teeth directed them gently. "Let's keep it just to the core group," Danielle had said. The core group. Margaret's eyes had fluttered, unsure if she'd heard it right. But then Danielle had turned toward her, voice soft and blade sharp. "Mom, maybe just this one. It's for the holiday card." She wasn't angry, not yet. That would come later. At that moment it felt like someone had gently placed a hand over her mouth and whispered, "Shh, you're not needed here." You felt that too, haven't you? That quiet exclusion. When people don't raise their voices, don't throw insults, but erase you with kindness, with smiles, with rehearsed politeness. It's harder to confront, harder to explain, harder to forgive. Inside the house, the casserole she'd made her late husband's favorite sat untouched. The scent of rosemary and garlic clung to her cardigan like a final plea for acknowledgement. But no one noticed. The golden daughter, Danielle, moved effortlessly among the guests, her voice melodic, her smile a performance perfected over decades. She had always been the star, the polished one, the achiever. Margaret had raised her to be strong, ambitious, unstoppable. She hadn't known that in doing so, she was raising the very woman who'd one day quietly deem her obsolete. And Michael, the son-in-law who never quite met her eyes, clutched a wine glass like it was a trophy for surviving the day. Margaret had caught the way he smirked when Danielle made passive-aggressive remarks, how his silence was always conveniently timed. They didn't say she was too old, but it was in the way they avoided asking her opinion. The way Danielle re-explained every topic Margaret spoke on, as if translating from senile to presentable. The way the others nodded sympathetically, their eyes distant. And the children, they barely looked up from their devices, except Ava, the youngest granddaughter who'd slipped her a secret smile over the dinner table and mouthed, "I love you." That smile would linger, long after the others had faded. Have you ever been in a room full of people you love and felt like furniture? The day passed like a performance she had not been cast in. She played the part of the quiet mother, the dutiful grandmother, the invisible matriarch. But inside something ancient stirred, something she'd buried for years under compromise, under silence, under sacrifice. You see, Margaret hadn't always been this woman, the one left out of family photos. She was once the storm in her marriage, the spine of the house, the secret keeper of her children's darkest hours. She had fought for her marriage, for her children, for her sanity. And the scars she bore weren't visible, but they ran deep. She remembered the time she had to lie to bill collectors so the mortgage wouldn't be taken. Or the night Danielle came home shaking mascara streaked across her cheeks, and Margaret sat with her in the dark for hours without asking a single question, just holding her. And yet here she was now, an afterthought in orthopedic shoes. That night, while everyone else sipped wine and played charades, Margaret stood in the hallway staring at the family photo framed on the wall, last year's. She was in it. Back then they still pretended. Her fingers brushed the glass. She looked closely. Everyone else smiled so widely she hadn't even realized she wasn't. No one expected her to say anything. Margaret never made scenes. She was the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who smoothed over the chaos and held secrets with a grace that demanded nothing in return. But something shifted that night. Not an explosion, not a breakdown. A quiet vow. She left the next morning without saying goodbye, packed her small bag, slipped out before the sun rose, and left a note that simply read, "Don't worry, I won't be in the next photo either." The drive back to her house was silent, save for the hum of tires slicing through damp asphalt. Morning mist clung to the windshield like ghosts with nowhere else to go. Margaret didn't turn on the radio. Silence suited her. Now it was the only sound that didn't lie. At every red light, she felt the note she'd left behind throb like a second heartbeat in her chest. She hadn't signed it. She didn't need to. They'd know. But what they didn't know, what they'd never cared enough to see, was that Margaret had been unraveling for years, not in the way people imagine, Not with sobbing or pills or locked bathroom doors. No, her unraveling had been dignified, graceful, a slow fade like old wallpaper peeling at the corners while everyone commented on the charming vintage feel of the house. You know that kind of pain, don't you? The one that doesn't scream, it settles. It builds a home inside your ribcage and paints its walls with every time they made you feel small. She stopped at a gas station, bought herself a hot coffee that burned the roof of her mouth, and sat in the parking lot for a full hour. Not thinking, just existing. No calls, no texts. They'd gotten her message, and they chose silence. Danielle was probably too busy rationalizing the whole thing to her siblings. Margaret could imagine the scene, the raised eyebrows, the dismissive shrugs, the way Danielle's voice would go breathy and innocent as she said, "I don't know why she always takes things so personally." Because that's how they rewrite you. Once you step outside the role they assigned you, they don't ask why. They ask what's wrong with you. At home, the air smelled faintly of lavender and books. She hadn't had time to take down the holiday decorations. The ceramic snowmen mocked her with frozen grins. She passed by the hallway mirror without looking. She wasn't ready yet. Instead, she walked into the guest room, the one no one ever stayed in anymore, and opened the old cedar chest by the window. Inside, layers of lives, long outgrown baby blankets, ballet shoes, report cards, sympathy cards, pieces of a woman who had existed only in the margins of other people's stories. She reached beneath the stack and pulled out the album. Not the one from the living room. This one had no gold embossing, no curated smiles, just raw moments, messy and real. She turned page after page, watching her former selves blur by the young wife with eyes too hopeful. The mother with hands always full, the woman who learned to smile without needing to be seen. And then she found it. A photo Danielle had taken when she was 15. A rare moment when mother and daughter were laughing together, real laughter, their faces inches apart. Margaret had forgotten this even existed. Her hand trembled. Somewhere along the line, the girl in that photo had become the woman who said core group like it was a compliment to exclusion. And Margaret, she had become the woman who accepted it. But not anymore. You might be thinking, what's the point? She's older now. The time for change is past. That's what they want you to believe. That it's too late to reclaim your voice. That if you haven't already demanded your place, you no longer deserve one. But here's the truth. Some women don't burn bridges. They bury them, and when they rise, they do it without warning. That week, Margaret did something no one expected. She booked a solo trip, Greece. Not for the weather or the views, but because it was the place she'd always wanted to see and never did. Because no one ever asked her where she wanted to go. She didn't tell anyone, not Danielle, not her other children, not even Ava, though she knew the little girl would have beamed with curiosity. She packed light, only what she could carry. No gifts, no obligations, just her and a worn journal with the words, "You still matter," written on the inside cover. And when the plane lifted off the ground, Margaret didn't cry. She didn't even smile. She simply exhaled like someone who had been holding their breath for 40 years. Danielle noticed her absence 5 days later, not because she missed her, but because the casserole dish was still missing. The one with the blue trim that Margaret always brought like a quiet signature. It had become a fixture at family gatherings, like the salad tongs no one could find, or the dog that barked when wine was poured. She called, no answer. Texted, read but not replied. Then came the group chat message to the siblings. "Has anyone heard from Mom?" She left early, just making sure she's okay. A response from James, the youngest. "Maybe she just needed space. She's not our responsibility, Danny." And from Claire, always the echo. "Honestly, she's been acting weird lately. Maybe it's just old age." There it was. The final erasure. When they don't understand your silence, they pathologize it, rewrite it as confusion, as drama, as senility. That way they never have to look inward, never have to ask themselves why the woman who gave them everything finally walked away. But you're not surprised, are you? You've seen it too, the moment the nurturer grows a spine and suddenly becomes a threat. They don't mourn your absence, they manage it. Across the ocean, Margaret sat in a quiet taverna on the island of Paros, sipping bitter coffee and watching the light dance across the whitewashed walls. No one knew her here, and that was the point. The owner, a weathered man named Theo, had taken a liking to her. He brought her olives she didn't ask for, told her stories in broken English about his mother, his daughters, his garden. Margaret listened not to understand but to feel the rhythm of a life not entangled with her own. She filled her journal. Pages of things she'd never said. Memories she hadn't allowed herself to touch in years, like how she cried alone in the car after Danielle's wedding because no one had saved her a seat in the front row, or how her own birthday was always a footnote in other people's plans. The pain didn't bleed anymore. It inked itself calmly, resolutely. And every now and then she allowed herself to imagine their faces, not with anger, with a strange, distant curiosity. She wondered if Danielle still spun narratives around her absence, if Michael ever admitted to rolling his eyes at her cooking, if any of them noticed that Ava, sweet Ava, hadn't smiled in the holiday photo that year. Then 10 days and her phone rang. Unknown number. She stared at it, thumb hovering. Curiosity won. Mom. Ava. Margaret's chest clenched. Mom, it's me, it's Ava. I borrowed Mom's phone when she was in the shower. Are you okay? Margaret blinked at the sea, struggling to find her voice. It came out smaller than expected. I'm okay, sweetheart. I'm resting. There was a pause, then a whisper. I wish I could rest too. It broke something in her, or maybe it stitched something back together. She wasn't sure. They spoke for 10 minutes, short sentences, long silences. But there was love in the space between the words, the kind that doesn't beg for approval, only understanding. After the call, Margaret sat there still, the waves crashing like applause for a decision no one else had witnessed. That night she wrote Ava a letter. Not an explanation, a torch. They will teach you that love must be earned, that silence is graceful, that sacrifice is your inheritance. But remember, the ones who clip your wings often call it protection. Fly anyway. She didn't send it, not yet, because this wasn't the end. It was only the tremor before the quake. The obituary came 2 weeks after she returned. Margaret stood in her front yard, garden shears in hand, pruning the wild lavender that had taken over the fence. Summer inched toward its final breath, and the light had that early evening gold, the kind that made everything look more honest. The mail sat in a neat stack on the porch bench, catalogs, coupons, and one ivory envelope with calligraphy so pristine it looked machine-made. No return address. She opened it slowly, already bracing. Inside, a memorial program. At the top, in bold serif letters, in loving memory of Jameson T. Wallace. Beloved husband, father and grandfather. Her late husband. A funeral she hadn't been told about. Not even a phone call. Not a whisper. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. Her eyes scanned the elegant program, the list of speakers, the chosen scripture, the curated photos, and then stopped. There was the family photo, the same one she had been excluded from, enlarged, centered, framed in soft dove gray. She wasn't in it, not even in the collage on the back. 27 years of marriage, 3 children, countless sacrifices. And now they had written her out completely. What would you do if your entire life was rewritten without your name in it? Would you rage? Would you weep? Would you try to make them see? Or would you do what she did? Margaret placed the envelope down like it was radioactive. She didn't cry. Not immediately. The first emotion that rose wasn't grief, it was awe. Awe at how thoroughly and precisely they had erased her. Not in fury, but in indifference. And there it was, the moment of clarity. The truth. They hadn't left her out of the photo because she was too old. They'd left her out because she was no longer useful to the illusion. She had become too real, too inconvenient, a mirror they didn't want reflecting in the frame. When Jameson died, they didn't think she'd matter. They assumed she would be a complication, a name to stumble over during speeches, a reminder of years they had rewritten in softer tones. Margaret was no longer the grieving widow. She was the discarded character from a season no one talked about anymore. But they had underestimated her silence, her distance, her power. She attended the funeral, not in mourning but in steel. She didn't walk in through the front. She slipped into the back of the church, 15 minutes late, dressed in midnight blue, not black, with her silver hair pinned in a perfect chignon. Her heels clicked softly down the aisle like punctuation marks. People turned. Danielle's face froze mid-conversation with the pastor. She saw Margaret and paled. Margaret didn't smile. She sat in the last pew alone. She listened to the tributes, the half-truths, the glossy reimaginings of a man who in life had needed her to survive and in death was offered up like a saint carved from her patience. No one mentioned her name. Not once, but then near the end, when the pastor opened the floor for any final words, a small voice rang out. I have something. Ava. She stood, hands shaking, holding a piece of paper that looked like it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. I know everyone has already said a lot about Grandpa, she began, voice quivering, but I just wanted to say something for Grandma Margaret. The silence was deafening. She's the one who taught me how to tie my shoes, who picked me up from school when Mom was late, who told me stories about stars and made me believe I was made of them too." Danielle's mouth parted, stunned. Ava continued, "I don't know why she wasn't in the program or the pictures, but I remember everything she did, and I just wanted to say, I saw her." Margaret didn't cry, but something in her soul wept not from sadness but recognition. It was enough. She left before the service ended. She didn't need to stay. Her presence had already rewritten the story. That night back home, she took the memorial envelope, the photo, and the program, and burned them in the fireplace. She watched the flames curl around the curated images, devour the names that had tried to forget her. And when the fire had finished, she whispered, not with venom, but with peace, "I do not exist in your memory, but I live in hers." In the days that followed, no one reached out. Not Danielle, not Claire, not even James, whose silence was so predictable it hurt more than any word he could have said. Grief should have brought them closer, but Margaret knew now grief only amplified what was already there. Absence reveals more than presence ever could. She didn't check the family group chat. She didn't answer the door when Claire drove by and knocked, pretending to drop off leftover flowers. She didn't respond to Danielle's thin apology email, one line, one breathless excuse. "Sorry, we didn't realize the funeral notice didn't reach you. Things were chaotic." As if her omission had been an accident. As if decades of dismissal could be tucked under the rug of oops. But Margaret wasn't playing the role anymore. The quiet mother had exited the stage. Instead, she built a new rhythm. She started each morning with a walk. Through the park, past the old bookstore to the corner cafe where the barista, a girl with a pierced eyebrow and a lilac tattoo, had begun remembering her name. "Miss M," she'd say, sliding over a hot cup, "you're glowing today." And maybe she was. Not from makeup or youth, but from something deeper, something fierce. The glow of a woman no longer seeking approval. A woman no longer trying to squeeze herself into frames she was never meant to fit. You see, people talk about letting go like it's an act of surrender, but sometimes it's an act of defiance. Margaret wasn't giving up. She was giving back, returning the burden, the guilt, the manipulation to the ones who'd gifted it to her, wrapped in bows of duty and blood. She joined a writing group on Thursdays. They met in a library basement that smelled like dust and ambition. Mostly women, mostly older, all with stories they had once swallowed. Now they wrote them out messily, angrily, beautifully. Margaret wrote about silence, about casseroles no one thanked her for, about holidays that felt like obligations, about being the backbone and the scapegoat, the hero and the ghost. One night she read a piece aloud. It wasn't long, barely a page. She spent decades sewing her family's wounds shut with her own skin. They called it love. She called it survival. The room was quiet afterward. And then applause. Not the loud kind, the real kind, the kind that says, "We saw it too." Margaret went home that night with her heart heavier, but also more whole. Meanwhile, across town, Danielle spiraled. The obituary had been reprinted after Ava's outburst. More photos added. One of Jameson and Margaret from the late 90s, a last-minute addition buried at the bottom. Danielle told herself it was enough, a compromise, a correction. But it wasn't. The guilt had begun to claw at the back of her throat, because she knew what she'd done, that she had excluded her mother not because of oversight, but because of control. Because every time Margaret entered a room, Danielle felt reduced, uncentered, diminished. And isn't that the curse of the golden child? The need to shine so brightly, even if it means dimming the one who lit the first fire? She called Ava in a panic that week, asked her not to mention Grandma anymore just for now. Ava, wise beyond her years, said nothing. But she'd already started her own journal, titled Things I'll Never Forget. Margaret's name was on every page. You wonder now, will they ever change? Will Danielle apologize? Will Claire wake up? Will James call? It doesn't matter, because Margaret stopped waiting. Some women wait their entire lives for recognition. For the moment, someone turns to them and says, "You mattered." But the truth is, no one can hand you worth. You claim it, alone, in the quiet, without applause. Margaret planted rosemary by her windowsill, not because it meant remembrance, but because it reminded her of strength. She cooked for herself now small meals full of herbs and intention. She wrote letters she never sent. She wore lipstick on Tuesdays. She no longer flinched at her reflection. And in her eyes something flickered. Not forgiveness, not bitterness, freedom. The kind that comes when you finally learn this, the people who erased you were never your mirror. They were only your canvas. Autumn arrived like a soft ending, leaves curling inward air, tasting of endings and memory. Margaret watched it unfold from the comfort of her porch, wrapped in a hand-knit shawl she'd made during her early 30s, back when everything she crafted was for someone else. Now finally it was hers. She had learned the shape of her solitude. It was not a void. It was a sanctuary. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, as she brewed tea and flipped open her notebook, the doorbell rang. 3 soft chimes, not urgent, not expectant. When she opened the door, Ava stood there, alone. Her backpack hung off one shoulder. Her sweater sleeves tugged over her hands. Her eyes, impossibly older than they should be, met Margaret's with quiet fire. "I told them I was staying at a friend's. I needed to see you." Margaret stepped aside without a word. Some truths don't need invitation, they carry their own key. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Margaret had once braided Danielle's hair and wiped chocolate off Claire's cheeks. Ava looked around like she was seeing the house for the first time, though she had been here 100 times before. And then she said it. "They act like you don't exist." Margaret's heart cracked open not from pain but from relief. Because someone finally said it. She didn't cry, Ava did. "I don't want to forget you," she whispered. "And I don't want to become like them." Margaret reached across the table, her fingers brushing the girl's knuckles. "Then don't," she said. "You don't have to carry their silence." Ava stayed the night. They made soup, read poetry, fell asleep on the couch under 2 old blankets. Margaret didn't ask questions. She just offered stillness, the kind only women who have endured truly understand. By morning, Ava had written a letter to her mother. Margaret didn't read it, but she saw the pressure marks where the pen had pressed too hard. She saw the envelope tremble in Ava's hand. "I'm going to mail it," she said, "and whatever happens, happens." Margaret nodded, and in that moment the generational wound, the one no one had ever named, began to heal. Because here's what no one tells you: cycles don't break with rage. They break with one person choosing to live differently. Ava left before noon. As she walked down the garden path, she turned and smiled. Not the smile of a child. The smile of someone who had seen the truth and survived it. Weeks passed. Margaret's writing group nominated her for a local reading. She stood in a small theater one rainy Friday evening and shared a piece called The Missing Frame, a story about a woman who vanished from her family photo only to find her own face in the reflection of a lake halfway across the world. She didn't mention names, but the room was silent when she finished. That kind of silence that wraps around your bones and says, "We heard you." Afterward, a woman approached, her older, elegant eyes damp. "Your story," she said, "felt like mine." Margaret smiled. It always did. You see, Margaret's story wasn't unique. That's what made it powerful. It was the story of every woman who had been softened into invisibility, who had given without return, who had been cropped out of the photo but remained at the heart of the frame. A few days later, a small envelope arrived in the mail. No name on the return address, just one word, Ava. Inside was a photo. It was hand-drawn, pencil-faint lines sketched with trembling care. A living room. A group of people sitting close. On the couch at the center, a woman with silver hair and quiet eyes held a cup of tea. Around her, children, books, a dog, a window full of sunlight. And on the back, written in Ava's slanted handwriting, "This is the photo they'll never take, so I drew it instead. You're not missing anymore." Margaret pressed the drawing to her chest. And that was when it happened, the shift. Not loud, not grand, just a quiet moment of liberation. A soul once confined by expectation and silence, taking one final breath before unfolding its wings. She no longer needed their photos, their versions, their permission. She had her truth, her story, her name. And it would not be forgotten. The woman who knows her worth doesn't beg, she watches. Then she rises.